Hi, hello, welcome to the Physionic podcast. It's been, 4 months, something along those lines, since I released my last episode. And certainly something that's been on my mind, but as I said over the last several episodes, this is a much better format for me simply because I know I can't make a promise that I can continue to release these episodes on a specific basis, like a week-to-week basis or month-to-month basis or anything of that nature. And I kind of wanted to do things in a bit of a more Dan Carlin style. If you're familiar with, I believe his name is Dan Carlin, the history buff, where he releases these like 5-hour episodes extremely infrequently, but they're incredibly popular because he just knows what he's talking about. I certainly wouldn't say that I'm Dan Carlin's level, him to history, me towards molecular biology, cell biology, and physiology, but still, that style is certainly very appealing. That said, I have a number of different topics to discuss today. So to give you a rundown on the different things that I plan on discussing, depending on if I derail and go off on particular tangents from time to time, which I'm, what's the expression? I'm wont to do. Another one that I actually don't know the origin of, and I need to look up. So the topics that I wanted to discuss are, I want to give an update on my sucralose on insulin sensitivity investigation. So 4 months ago, I was nearing the end of that. And I think in that podcast episode, I'd mentioned that I don't think that sucralose has a negative effect on insulin sensitivity. And I was a little on the fence because I hadn't finished reading all the studies and whatnot, and kind of, giving myself time to think about the data and whatnot. And I'd like to give an update on that because my stance has reversed on that. The other thing I wanted to discuss was the insulin myth. So I released a video called The Insulin Myth, and then I released a follow-up video on losing body fat when you're insulin resistant. So I'd like to discuss that. And then I wanted to mention recently, as of this podcast recording, I've been doing a lot of digging into the Carbohydrate-Insulin model of obesity, which is going to be very related to my videos, the insulin myth and the insulin resistance videos. And what I did was compare the Carbohydrate-Insulin model based off of 6 different scientific reviews and meta-analyses against the conventional model. So I'd like to describe that in some depth here for the podcast. If you've watched all of these videos, you probably are going to be running across a lot of recycled information. So certainly don't feel obligated to listen to this, but certainly it's a more relaxed format since I don't necessarily have to follow a predetermined path that I typically do for my actual videos, which are either, have notes on exactly the points that I have to hit. And I've got some loose notes here, but like I said, sometimes I go off on tangents, which is one of the beauties of podcasting. Another one I wanted to discuss, another topic, is GlyNAC supplementation on anti-aging. That was a video that really took off over the last few months, and I got some really excellent feedback from people. People have been incredibly kind to me in regard to my detailed study analyses. I really thought it was a minority of people. I still think it's a minority of people that are actually interested in sitting down and listening to a person expound on the analytics of multiple studies. If I put together like 10 studies or 15 studies, which takes a tremendous amount of work, but I still do it for a number of reasons I won't go into right now. But the fact that there are people that are actually interested in watching it all the way through is pretty mind-blowing to me. And that video gained, like 10,000 views or something like that. And I got a lot of really supportive comments, really kind comments from people, which was really humbling, and I'm very thankful for that. So anyway, I wanted to discuss a little bit more on that GlyNAC supplementation for anti-aging. Then I wanted to discuss hyaluronic acid for reversing skin aging and skin wrinkling. So those are roughly the topics that I'm going to be talking about. But before I get to that, an ad. No, just kidding. I wanted to mention, if you're watching the podcast, you might be wondering what this is or why I'm not using my dad's mug that I shamelessly plugged without being sponsored. He had no idea. I plugged his mug that he invented in my "Coffee is Killing You" video. So for those unaware, I released a video called "Coffee is Killing You," where I was essentially debunking Dr. Mike Hansen, who's another YouTube personality, but he's a medical doctor, and unfortunately, I don't think that from the little bit that I've seen, he doesn't seem to cite references. He just kind of says stuff, and then he sort of expects. I think the impression that I get is he just expects, because under his videos he has licensed physician or licensed doctor underneath, like he has this accreditation, which he absolutely deserves. But he leans on that entirely too much and doesn't do enough reading and proving his points through scientific analysis. So anyway, I took one of his videos where he had said coffee is killing you slowly, and I just made some counterpoints of like, okay, I mean, all the things that he's saying is correct. His argument was that coffee contains acrylamides, which is true. And there's coffee in this mug. That, yes, coffee contains acrylamides, which to his point was this toxic substance that would ultimately kill us slowly. And there are other foods as well that contain acrylamides. Essentially, acrylamides are produced by anything that would be heated, I think, to 120 degrees C. I think that was the magic number. You get this combination of these different molecules, sugars to proteins, that end up attaching to one another and create acrylamides. And there's a few other processes that occur as well. And ultimately, that is known to be quote-unquote toxic to our body. Okay, fair enough. So I made this counter argument of like, okay, well, have you looked at the amount of acrylamides in coffee? They're pitifully small. And then I announced the amount of acrylamides through the total consumption and exposure through our environment and from our foods. The total amount of exposure of the human body to acrylamides is unbelievably low. I mean, he had cited, when I mean cited, he said a study showed this effect of acrylamides on brain health, or this study showed this effect on cancer risk. But he doesn't actually cite the study. He doesn't show the studies. He doesn't put links to the study. He just says studies. Studies show. It's like, okay. I mean, you might as well say my mom said. Like, to me, that doesn't mean anything. It's saying studies show, and then you're essentially relying on your medical degree to say, oh, you can believe me because I'm a doctor. Again, if you've been with Physionic long enough, you know that's not how I operate. After I graduate with my PhD, I'm still not going to be like, you should trust everything I said just because I have a PhD. Or currently with my master's, you shouldn't. I mean, sure, I have expertise, and I would love for people to have some level of trust that, yeah, I know what I'm talking about, or I have a good reasoning, and maybe I can't get into that reasoning. But you're not going to hear me say, studies show, and then I'm not going to show any of the studies. I mean, one of the main draws of Physionic is that I do these detailed study analyses. Anyway, again, tangent. So he ends up saying these things, and then he describes, okay, well, acrylamides do this much damage to the brain and to the cancer and all that stuff. But those studies used at the very lowest end, because I looked up some studies, used 2,000 times more acrylamide than we are exposed to on a daily basis. 2,000 times more. And that's the lowest end. The highest end was up to 100,000 times more acrylamide to see these toxic effects. I mean, even if you tried your hardest, unless maybe you genuinely just created a vat of just straight acrylamide, 100% pure acrylamide, and just dipped your body into it, there's no way that you could be exposed to enough acrylamide for that to be a problem. So ultimately, I disagreed with him on that front because dosing is it matters. It of course matters. It's a huge part. And then he based his entire argument on a mechanism. He just based on acrylamide toxic, therefore toxic acrylamide kills you. Okay. But if you look at long-term data on coffee consumption, I mean, there's just a wealth of information. And I cited multiple studies, associative studies, granted. But even so, these associative studies, they still, if you would see this like remarkable toxic effect of coffee, you wouldn't see this like study after study after study showing that coffee consumption led to longer life, led to healthier life, reduced mortality, better cardiovascular health, better diabetes, fighting against diabetes. I mean, there's just on brain health. I think brain health, there was no effect or no relationship, I should say, in that the greater the coffee consumption, there was no relationship, meaning it didn't have a negative it didn't hurt the brain. It just didn't necessarily have a positive relationship where it was also helping the brain. And that's just, that's all these are associative. So I totally understand that that's not foolproof, but still I also don't see any controlled trials or cause and effect trials that indicate these significant toxic effects. I mean, let's say with coffee, if you were to, let's say we take people that don't consume coffee and then just drown them in coffee, up to some pretty high limit. Let's say 5 cups of coffee. Some people are probably looking sideways like, oh, 5 is a lot. I'm just throwing out a number. It might not be a lot for you. Totally get it. But let's say they start consuming 5 cups of coffee for 16 weeks or 6 months or a year, which should be pretty easy to do. I mean, that shouldn't be a difficult thing. Just continuously consume coffee. It's not like a diet thing where they're going to start experiencing hunger and like all these different things. So let's say they did it for a year, and then you just take a bunch of different health markers before and then after. I'll bet that you would not experience any negative effects. You might, especially if you go with caffeine naive people and give them 5 cups of coffee or whatever it might be. Yeah, okay, then you might start seeing like maybe some stomach discomfort. You might see agitation, anxiety, all those different things. But those are more psychological measures that are perfectly reasonable. Everybody understands that if you overconsume caffeine, if you consume a lot of caffeine, you're going to start feeling really agitated. That's not what I'm talking about, though. I'm talking about like heart health. I'm talking about like cholesterol levels. I'm talking about it'd be tough to measure cancer risk. There's a few different markers you could look at, but you could look at inflammation. You could look at different things like that. So the big picture being that there's so much evidence that points to coffee not being detrimental and actually probably being a little bit beneficial compared to this mechanistic argument that he had offered. Anyway, that all to say, returning to this mug, you let me go, and I will really, you let me go uninterrupted, and I will really talk for a long time about the mechanisms and whatnot of the science, or the science in general. Anyway, so this mug, in that video, I joked that I was I was affiliated with Big Coffee Mug. So it's not Big Coffee, but Big Coffee Mug. And the reason for that is because because he has a business called Jovio, 10 Perfect Mugs. And the Jovio mug is something that he invented. He thought about it, I think, like over 20 years ago. He burnt his lips or he burnt his mouth when drinking tea, I think, or maybe coffee, doesn't matter. So some hot liquid. And then he thought to himself, like, there has to be an easier way for us to be drinking really hot beverages. So he thought to himself, okay, I have a physics background and I have a mechanical engineering background. So let me think about this. Let me design something. And he spent years designing this mug that has this phase shift material inside of it. So you put in the piping hot coffee or tea or whatever hot beverage that you have into this mug, and the heat gets sucked into the phase shift material, which drops the temperature within 2 minutes down to a drinkable temperature. So from piping hot to drinkable temperature, and then maintains it there for like 2 to 3 hours afterwards. So like 2 hours later, you still have a very warm beverage that you can still drink. And all of that without batteries. Really cool invention. So anyway, he started this business, and he's not known for like marketing or anything. I mean, it's very much a small business. It's just him. So, he makes the mugs. He designed the mugs, he makes the mugs and all that stuff, and then just ships them out. It's a really small business, so it's not like even if he did pay me for that promotion, it's not like I'd be making millions of dollars or anything like that. So anyway, I'm using this mug if you're watching the podcast, and this is the first time I've actually used this mug, much to my dad's chagrin probably. And it doesn't look like the mugs that I mentioned in the video, or that showed in the video. And this is actually a prototype of that process. This is still a phase shift mug. This is something he designed. It looks very sleek. I like it, but it's very rudimentary. It's not nearly as, maybe you disagree, but it's not nearly as nice as the finished product. And so just so if anybody's wondering why I'm not using my dad's mug, I technically am. I'm just using a much earlier version of the mug. My finished product mug is the one that I bought from him, and it's in my car. So I just had two, so I just went ahead and used this one for my acrylamide coffee consumption. Okay, that was a lot. Wow. What did I talk for? Let me look at my timer here. About 15 to almost 20 minutes just to talk about this mug, and then I described a bunch of science. That's how life is for me. Again, assuming that I can speak on a topic uninterrupted. All right, so the first topic that I want to discuss is actually what I want to do with Physionic. I did want to speak to this because if, let's see, since January, I released a video on Dr. Sinclair and Dr. David Sinclair, Harvard researcher. You may or may not know him. He's been pretty popular for a while. He's gotten under some scrutiny. I don't know anything about that. I haven't looked into it. I'm just too busy to pay attention to that. And since I've never endorsed him or anything, I never bothered to even look into any of that stuff. But I did want to cover one of his papers, just independent of all his backlash or his accolades. I didn't care about any of that stuff. He'd just been working on this paper for, I think, over 10 years. And he eventually released this paper, and I thought to myself, okay, well, it'd be a great opportunity to cover a paper that he spent so much time working on. And that's what I did. I released this video where I discussed the science and broke down all the science of this massive paper. I mean, it's a cell. I think it's just a cell paper, which is like the top tier, along with Nature and maybe Science, all three of those. So it's this huge paper, and it was really cool. I mean, I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed analyzing it. It certainly leaves you with a lot more questions for the future, but essentially the big picture of it was that our aging process is not merely through somatic mutations. It's not just through, what I mean by that is genetic breaks and mutations that occur in our genome. It also occurs through, and there's many other reasons, mitochondrial dysfunction, telomere shortening, a bunch of other ones as well. But he had provided a mammalian proof, a proof in animals that, because all the other research had been done in yeast, that you can do damage to the DNA. The DNA can be repaired. The structural DNA can be repaired exactly perfectly, and still you can undergo aging, which is a cool finding. I mean, that's really cool. And he showed this in animals where he had induced a genetic model where he could turn on and off the ability, the cell's damage to DNA damage. And if you're interested in exactly how he does that, I'd recommend the video, because it goes into exactly the mechanisms of how he does that. It's a cool mechanism that is used in molecular biology in general, but in this context is really cool. So he ends up showing that these mice, if they undergo a ton of damage to their DNA, and then you check the DNA, let's say a couple days later or whatever it might be, sometime later, that the DNA will have been repaired. Their genes will have been perfectly repaired. And you can compare that against the animals that didn't have their DNA damaged. And then you would think to yourself, okay, well, if that's the case, then fine. They should be healed and they should be good to go. Kind of like, if you have a scratch on your skin, it heals and you don't get a scar, it's perfect. Like, it's back to normal. That's one of the incredible things about of our biology, that we can repair ourselves. I mean, that is to me, that is one of the coolest things in the world, across all genres of life. That is super cool. The fact that we can insult our body, we can do damage to our body, and our body just fuses back together and just fixes itself, and sometimes perfectly. So anyway, does that happen to DNA? The answer is not really, because of epigenetic aging. So yes, the structural components, the DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acids that make up the DNA, that make up the genes, are intact, but the tags that are applied to those DNA are then now changed, or can be changed. And that leads to this process of epigenetic aging, where their DNA is completely identical to the same aged mouse, but they are much, much older in their physiology. And there's only some preliminary proof that their physiology was changed. And then he had also provided a little bit of proof on a molecular means of reversing that epigenetic aging, but he really just changes the epigenetic profile. He doesn't actually prove that there's a reversal in the physiological processes, like kidney health, frailty, skin health, all that stuff. So it's a really cool paper. And I would love to see more data on that stuff, especially on the reversal side, to see if we can experience some of that reversal in humans, especially, which should be possible. I mean, we could definitely do this kind of experimentation in humans. Probably not the actual. We'd have to take cells from humans and then do it to the cells outside of the human, because we can't inject these extremely experimental systems into the bloodstream or into the interstitial fluid or anything like that of a human being, because that could lead to really disastrous consequences. So, but I'm saying it would still be cool to take human cells out of a human being and see if we can reverse those epigenetic changes that occur. So that would be another step to take. Okay, so I explained this video and I released this video, and it took off. I didn't expect it to. I got like 100,000 views or something like that. I got glowing comments. Again, incredibly thankful. And I gained tons of subscribers. Physionic grew quite a lot. And then the GlyNAC video also really took off. Not quite to the same degree, but still, several thousand people watched that as well and seemed to have some great commentary. So ultimately, I ended up gaining, thousands and thousands of new subscribers, which is really, really humbling, and I'm incredibly thankful. And it got me excited, it got me excited about the future. I've always been excited about the future. I knew it was going to come at some point, and I'm still far, far, far off from realizing that dream. But I did want to discuss that dream because I don't think I've ever actually discussed what my plans are with Physionic. The goal for Physionic for me is that while, yes, it's selfish. One thing I'd like to point out is that Physionic is, in certain respects, a selfish endeavor. I started Physionic because I wanted to have an outlet where I could learn faster than what my professors could teach me. My professors, I love learning. It's like to my core, it's who I am. And if I'm not learning, I'm essentially dead. I just don't feel alive. So, and I've just been thankful. I'm in this position where I'm learning about the field that I should be in. This is the field I should be in. I'm 100% certain of that. And I've been certain of that for many years now. But when I started Physionic, I was so fascinated, so giddily excited. I've said this in a few videos about learning about my body and learning how our body functions. And it's really this world that just like, sometimes I just start like chuckling, just kind of uncontrollably, like giggling uncontrollably, because I just think to myself like that is just, it's so cool. So cool. Biology is incredible. And we are part of that. And we have the unique ability that we can study ourselves and we can study other creatures and all that stuff. But I limit it to us, to humans. And yeah, so I was learning so much about this stuff when I was going through my nutrition science courses, when I was going through my physiology courses and whatnot. But I was thinking to myself, like, I'm just so unsatisfied. I want to learn more. I want to learn faster. So I started Physionic, and I thought to myself, why would I just be learning these things for myself when I could be releasing this content out there for other people? And so that's what I was doing. I was reading and writing these articles and reading all the research. And to be fair, I wasn't very good at it. I was pretty poor. I was pretty bad at it. But at least in terms of reading research relative to where I am now. But I still tried my best, and I wrote these articles, and I tried to go into explaining the enzymatic reactions to what was happening inside the cells, to then what was happening within the tissues, to then what was happening to the whole body if you were to describe something like diabetes. And that really filled this gap for me. And then I thought to myself, well, if I'm releasing these articles, nobody's going to read these articles, so why don't I release videos? I started releasing these absolutely horrid videos. I mean, they're like, some of them were like 45 minutes long of me just talking to a camera. It was a GoPro camera. It was just this really crappy camera. I didn't have sound, nothing. I was just in a side room at my mom's house. I would drive home from college, so an hour and a half every weekend. It was literally every week. I never missed a week for years. Every weekend I went home, and when I went home, I would be reading all the research. I would write this article. I would shoot this video. I would edit this video. And I was so bad at all of it, but I still wanted to do it. And then I would release this content, and Physionic did not grow whatsoever for years. And that's my fault. That's because I should have known that nobody wanted to sit there and listen to 45 minutes of me just like thinking about what I want to say next. Like I would even have notes and whatnot, but it helped to a degree, but it didn't help nearly enough. And now the system that I have in place works far better. It's far more concise, and I can actually think about things beforehand when I present. And just from years of working on it, you eventually get better at thinking off the top of your head, especially when it comes to these study analyses, which of course I've got a presentation that I've already put together. So I have a logical flow of how I'm going to explain things. So I was really bad at it. And for a number of years, I was just continuing to grow so slowly. I mean, just painfully slowly. I'm talking, I remember I recently went back on my phone because I had taken a snapshot, and I think I had gained 100 subscribers in like 3 years or something like that. When it comes to social media growth, that is painfully slow, especially when you're spending an hour and a half driving home, doing tons of work, and then driving an hour and a half back to school so that you can make it for your classes. It was just so much work. And I remember I was incredibly frustrated, but it was completely my fault because I was too stubborn to think, why don't people want this information? I don't get it. Well, Nick, it's because you do a piss poor job of actually explaining it. Okay. So eventually, things evolved. I got better and all that. And Physionic then started to grow, especially around like 2020 and onwards. We're entering our 9th year. This is my 9th year doing Physionic without missing a week. I've been uploading content for 9 years, every single week, never missed a week. And it's been incredibly discouraging at times, but I just have this fierce goal in my head. I have this dream in my head of what I want and what I want people to have. And that's what I'm leading up to. So, just over the last like 6 months or so, I'd say Physionic has grown quite a lot. And, we're approaching 30,000 subscribers. Again, I'm so incredibly happy about that, but I'm even happier, to be honest with you, about the process that I have going. I feel like I'm able to create this niche for myself that's within this really crowded niche of health and medicine and physiology and stuff. There are other people that do that kind of stuff, but I don't think that they do it the way that I do it, and that's what I'm trying to bring forward. The overall goal is to bridge the gap between the public and understanding studies. And I want to be as transparent as I possibly can be about showing the data and explaining, like, this is how I'm thinking about it. And if you disagree, that's okay. As a matter of fact, I would like for you to mention why you disagree, because maybe I'm missing something. And there have been times where somebody has mentioned something and I'm like, that's a good point. And then I'll create amendments, or if it completely destroys the video, then I just take down the video. And that's the whole idea. I mean, to be as transparent as possible about this kind of stuff within reason. And I've been building up to this for obviously a number of years now, 9 years. And I've just been really excited about the fact that I have this system in place that seems to work really well. I mean, it makes me happy that I can go into the weeds and I can explain the mechanisms, which is super important to me. It's not just about like what's the outcome, which I understand a lot of people are just interested in what's the outcome, but understanding the mechanisms behind those outcomes is invaluable to me. So the overall goal of Physionic is that if I could ever get this thing to be large enough where I'm making enough money to not only support myself, but also support a small team of people, I would love to, one, obviously increase the quality of my videos. Currently, I do all my editing, which has been a labor of love and real hate at times. So, with me doing all this work and whatnot, don't get me wrong, I sometimes I really enjoy video editing, but it isn't what I'm here to do. I mean, I'm not a video editor. I'm not a social media mogul or anything like that. I'm just a guy that wants to learn more about the body. I want to have these set facts, not just reading abstracts. I want to have this absolutely gargantuan mountain of evidence behind me that I have personally read through. But I also understand that there's limitations to that. So the first growth that I'd like to see for Physionic is I'd love to eventually start paying a video editor. That would be one thing. Somebody that I can really put a lot of attention towards and work, back and forth with, and so that they can learn my style, and so I can maybe learn from them. And so then that would free me up to focus more on just study analysis and just on writing these scripts and whatnot, so I can explain things better for the public. Okay, so that's kind of step one. The next step after that would be, if I were to ever make enough money for this kind of stuff, I would love to start hiring other people, to hire other people that also have the qualifications to be able to read scientific evidence. That would be the next step. I would love to have a small group of other researchers that I would hire, and their job would just be to go through the literature and do exactly what I'm doing, but add another flavor in having kind of open table discussions that would be maybe live streamed or streamed or put out there somehow for the public, so that they can understand how researchers think about data, how they talk about data, how they disagree with one another, and ultimately come to a conclusion together. I would love to put that out there, because nobody has any idea about any of that stuff. Unless you get a PhD or you get a master's degree, you don't have any idea. I certainly didn't. Even as an undergrad, I had no idea how researchers do any of the stuff that they do. And it would just be so valuable, I think, and it would create a lot more trust in the scientific system. Not that there's no trust. Of course, there's a ton of trust, but I think a lot of people, a good minority of people, kind of deviate into these worlds where they just talk and they say things that make absolutely zero sense, and it's just like they just discount things that shouldn't be discounted, or they believe certain things that don't make any reasonable sense if they saw how a researcher goes about the way that they do research. Because there's a disconnect. They don't understand the process, and that's not a fault of them. Nobody explains the process. Nobody shows the process. So that's what I would love for Physionic to do, to not only come to outcomes, the macro, right, but also be able to figure out through studies all the mechanisms that led to those outcomes. So then again, we're going from the macro to the micro, and going from does supplement X help against diabetes? Let's say, does curcumin help against diabetes, right? So then you would read, let's say, 15 studies, maybe have a group of 3 researchers, or we'll call them researchers, read the studies, and then they, in a roundtable discussion, end up discussing each study. And that would be more of a raw format. And then maybe have one of them or a few of them, maybe just probably one of them, I don't know, I'm spitballing here, have a person go through and do the detailed study analysis that I've been doing, where, it's a presentation, it's well put together, but it's been pre-agreed on. This is how we're going to present this. and have the outcomes. And then on top of that, have the mechanisms for how does curcumin do all these different things. And not, I just get so tired of this idea of like so many people, and I understand why, because it's so much work to try to figure out the mechanisms or explain the mechanisms. But taking, okay, say curcumin again, people just use curcumin helps reduce blood sugar. It's like, how? And then they'll say, well, it affects the pancreas or it affects the muscle cells. It's like, okay, how? Dive deeper. Okay. Well, it affects the mitochondrion. Okay, how? I mean, it's get down to the chemical basis, the structure of curcumin. What about the structure of curcumin interacts with other molecules within the cells? How does it get into the cell? And then once it's there, what does it interact with and how does it modulate those molecules so that they have different effects across the cell that ultimately lead to a lowering of blood sugar? That's what I'm talking about. That's the level of detail that I would love for people to have, and so that we can really come to an understanding of, everything is just so broken. Everything is just so broken. I'm not even going on the tangent with medical doctors or how we teach research, how we teach how to interpret research. I think all of it is just so poorly done. There's a few people that I think do it really well, but they're often in these like niche areas like sports science or something along those lines. And there probably are others out there that I'm just not aware of, but I think the vast majority, they just look at abstracts and they're like, well, see, curcumin helps against diabetes according to this one study. And I fell into that at the beginning too. I was in that same camp, so I'm not immune from that. But then I just continued to feel unsatisfied. And I just can't imagine that there aren't other people that feel equally unsatisfied with that level of care, detail. It just one of the big pushbacks is again like, well, I see this from time to time, like comments that are like, well, this person said this thing, this person said this other thing, another doctor said that both of those are not true, it's actually this, and they all have evidence for their conclusion. It's like, well, wouldn't it be great to have a grouping of researchers, and I'm sure people would criticize this somehow. They'd be like, well, they've all been paid off by big pharma or, whatever it might be. But let's just put the cynical side aside for a second. Wouldn't it be great to have some researchers that look at like 15 studies on one topic and come to a conclusion? That's a much stronger basis. And it's not just like looking at the studies, it's actually analyzing the statistics to figure out, okay, they used a t-test when they had 3 comparisons. I'm just throwing something out there, which is completely inappropriate. You'd want to use an ANOVA. You'd want to use an analysis of variance. Like, that kind of detail to instill some level of trust that, oh, these people know what they're talking about. And I can hear and see where their thought process is going because they're expounding on it on a public platform. It's not behind closed doors. And then if I want to go to a little more honed version, I can go to the detailed study analyses. If I don't have time to sit there and listen for 4 hours to them debating back and forth about a number of different studies. And if I really don't have time for that either, then I can go to a really polished video, explaining everything. And then it can go in the reverse order. Somebody runs into the published, the shorter video, and then they're like, well, I don't agree with this, so I'll go to the detailed study analysis, try to understand where they're coming from, like see where the data is coming from and whatnot. I realize that some of this is a little bit idealistic because some people just don't have the time, or some people just are They just believe what they believe and they don't care. And I'm not actually talking to those people. I'm only talking to the people that genuinely want to understand with a strong degree of confidence, because it's not just coming from one study, it's not just coming from one person, it's coming from a multitude of people, and it's coming from a huge grouping of studies to come to a conclusion. Those people that want real answers, I feel like there's a huge group of people out there, probably I'd even argue a majority, that want to have that level of access to research. And especially, I think it's criminal that the public pays for research and then it gets put behind these paywalls, behind these journal paywalls, where now you have to pay $30 to have access to the paper for 24 hours or whatever it might be. That is, to me, that is insane. That people, that the research gets paid for by public funding, and then it gets published in a journal that's a private journal, and then they get to keep it and sequester it away and make sure that nobody can have it when it was paid for by the people. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever to me. And I'm thankful, I'm really glad that I think in 2010, I could have the date wrong, but sometime relatively recently, the U.S. government, at least in the United States, they said that any publicly funded research has to be open access, like has to be openly available. I think after like the first year, something like that, or maybe immediately, I don't know, something along those lines. It should be immediate, to be frank. It should be immediate, but whatever. So, I mean, that's just one step, right? Like, you just having access to the papers doesn't mean that you actually know how to read the papers. It doesn't mean that you understand what all the words mean. That doesn't mean that you understand statistical methods. That doesn't mean that you understand the experimental methods. There's all kinds of stuff that still needs to be figured out. So, yeah, big picture. You know, that's where I would love if Physionic ever grew to a stage that I could finance that kind of, just like have a small system in play, a small group, a small team of individuals that would make science more understandable without it being turned into a pop science channel. I patently refuse to turn Physionic into a pop science channel. The fibroblasts create collagen, and it's like little bloop sounds as, you know, a collagen molecule just appears, and it's like a cartoon image. I despise that stuff. I mean, I get it for other people. It's not, you know, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's horrible. I'm not saying anything negative for other people, but that is not how I operate. It's just not how my brain works. And I think that we have plenty of those, and it doesn't take much work to create that, if I'm completely honest with you. And I think what I'm suggesting takes a tremendous amount of work, and I am up for that challenge. I would love to be involved in that with a group of other people to make that a reality. So anyway, that's round. Yep. I touched on all my points just to make sure. So that's really what I would like to do in the future. You know, I don't know when that's going to happen. Could be 5 years from now. Could be 10 years from now. Could be 30 years from now. I don't know. But I'm certainly never going to stop. Physionic is just such an integral part of my life, as many of the people, as basically everybody in my life knows. I just can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop doing it. It's a serious obsession of mine. So am I ever going to, like, have I been discouraged in the past? Many, many, many times before. But I've always stuck to my guns. I've always continued to work on it, and I will continue to work on it because like makes me jump out of bed. I don't care about anything else more in terms of like an object or like a thing to do than Physionic. So it's not going to stop, and I don't know when that dream will be realized, but I will certainly give it the next many decades of my life to make that a reality. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to things that are actually going to help you. Let's discuss sucralose and insulin sensitivity. So last podcast episode, which I believe was in like November, something like that, I had mentioned that I was reading a number of studies on sucralose, and that's actually where I had shifted how I was doing my detailed study analyses, because initially I was just doing a single study at a time, but that, like I said, that's not that helpful. You need to be looking at a number of different studies and try to figure out if there are inconsistencies between studies. Why are there inconsistencies? Maybe there's a subgroup effect. Maybe it's the dosages. Maybe it's how they apply the substance, sucralose in this situation, whatever it might be. And sucralose was my most frustrating investigation. There was a tremendous amount of heterogeneity. There's tremendous differences in the results between studies. I ended up reading 12, 13, 14, 15 studies, something like that on the topic. It took me a long time. It was incredibly frustrating. And I still don't have a complete answer as to why there's so much heterogeneity, but I'm guessing that there's a genetic component that has not been uncovered in the science, because certain studies that had very similar methodologies ultimately led to two completely different results in measures of insulin sensitivity. And that's obviously very confusing. But then what you'd have to do in that scenario is look at the demographic that they applied sucralose to. So if it's for example, one study was in white women, Caucasian women, and another one was done in Asian men. There can be differences there, and the reaction that can occur physiologically. So that's like a subgroup effect. So then you'd have to be able to tease those out. And we don't have enough data on the topic to actually be able to tease those differences out. So I do think that, or maybe it could be something that's more related to specific genetics. Maybe there's a sucralose sensitivity, there's a cephalic insulin release. So sucralose interacts with your mouth, then your mouth taste buds or taste receptors specifically then send a signal to your pancreas, and your pancreas releases insulin. There are molecules that do that kind of stuff. It's pretty mild, but it does happen. So, maybe some people experience it, some people have that effect, some people don't have that effect, So those are kind of subgroup analyses, sensitivity analyses that need to be done using statistics. But you need a sample size, you need enough individuals to actually come to that conclusion, to be able to do the analysis. If you only have 30 people and 30 people, that may not be enough, especially when you're getting to effect sizes or the magnitude of the effect that are really insular, that really, really small, I guess I should say. Then you need more people in each group. So there's just a lot to consider. So ultimately, what I ended up saying is that sucralose seems like there's too much inconsistency. I think that there's something that scientists are missing. And I joke that that's probably why there's no meta-analyses on the topic or systematic reviews on the topic. there's one scientific review, as in just like a narrative review of like a researcher just kind of putting all the research together and just kind of talking about it. Like, this study found this and this study found this, and maybe it's because of this. But it's not like they're applying statistics to their scientific review. And so I was thinking about that. And I was like, I understand why there's no systematic review, because the research is just all over the place. Like you would end up with no effect of sucralose, even though you have studies that some show huge effects in one direction and other studies would have huge effects in the other direction of it being pro-insulin sensitivity or negative to insulin sensitivity. And I mean, as a researcher, if you have too many of those studies, you kind of have to think to yourself, like, something else is going on here. But exactly how to tease that out, you need more data. So, like I said, I don't think we have enough, but my conclusion was probably for people who suffer from, let's say, prediabetes or something along those lines, I would probably avoid sucralose consumption because there's probably a small insulin sensitivity hit that occurs. It's probably not massive. So even if you were to consume sucralose, I don't think that you're suddenly going to become diabetic, or that if you continuously consume sucralose, but the rest of your life is pretty healthy, I don't think that it's going to drive you towards diabetes or anything like that. But if you're pre-diabetic and you struggle with that, or you struggle with blood sugar regulation and whatnot, yeah, I'd probably avoid sucralose. Just simple as that, which is a completely different opinion to what I was leaning towards in the last podcast episode, because I think, if my memory serves me correctly, maybe I've been drinking too much coffee, who knows, and I have neurotoxicity. But if my memory serves me correctly, I think that I had mentioned that I was leaning towards it not having a negative effect on insulin sensitivity. But yeah, I think I've turned course slightly on that. Okay, so the next one I want to discuss is the insulin myth and losing body fat when insulin resistant. So I released this video where I covered just a few studies, just kind of peripherally discussed a few studies. And it was a comparison. It was essentially to tease out the effect that insulin has on body fat loss. And because the argument for a lot of people has been, well, the ketogenic diet or low carb diets are better because they lower insulin levels. And because you have lower insulin levels, then you have the ability to lose body fat. And because carbohydrates stimulate insulin. So if you drop your carbohydrates down to almost nothing or very low, then it'll be less permissive of insulin. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, because it's true. Insulin does stop fat breakdown. It stops lipolysis, and it leads to lipogenesis, or the production of more fat molecules from other substrates, as well as lipid uptake. So the taking up of fats into the fat cells, which then leads to the fat cells eventually growing. So mechanistically, that makes a lot of sense. However, of course, looking at mechanisms and then just assuming that that's the case, as I complained earlier about the coffee mechanism, doesn't always actually bear out when you look at the outcomes. So the most important thing is to look at the outcomes and then to look at the mechanisms, not to look at the mechanisms and then look at the outcomes. I mean, you can do it that way, but then you have to make sure that you're open to changing the mechanism if the outcome doesn't make any sense towards, in relation to the hypothesis that comes from the mechanism. So the mechanism is that insulin high fat storage high. That's it. And fat breakdown low. Fair enough. And that's true on a physiological level. That's exactly what insulin does. No one's debating that. However, when you look at studies that equate calories, and I guess another aspect of that video was that to indicate, is it the calories or is it the insulin? Because a lot of people also argue, well, calories don't matter. It's all about the insulin. So if we equate the calories and then the insulin, there are differences in the insulin potentially because one group is consuming high carbohydrates. So presumably they would have higher insulin levels, right? And the other group consumes low carbohydrates, so they would have lower insulin levels. Then that would mean that with the lower insulin, you'd be able to lose more body fat. And it turned out across a multitude of studies that that is not the case. And we're talking some studies, I mean, obviously lasting months. But then we have some really well-controlled studies, which are shorter in duration, which indicate is well-controlled as in like they don't even leave the lab. Like they're staying in the lab the entire time. And there were no differences in body fat loss. And then I included a study, I believe, that added fasting. So each one of the carbohydrate condition consumed 800 calories, which was way below their maintenance calories. The ketogenic condition consumed 800 calories, but in ketogenic, without any carbohydrates. And then the other condition was just water fasting. So they didn't consume anything. And guess who lost the most weight? Guess who lost the most body fat? It was the water fasting condition. But that's no shock because they're consuming 800 less calories than the other two conditions. Even though the other two conditions are in a calorie deficit, they're not in as much as eating nothing. So in that scenario, then the water fasting condition was losing a lot more body fat and losing a lot of weight. But then they compartmentalized, they tried to figure out, okay, well, how much of that weight is from fat loss and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was more fat loss in the water fasting condition. But then when they compared the two carbohydrate, the high carbohydrate, or higher, wasn't really high, but it was higher, certainly, carbohydrate condition versus the ketogenic condition, there were no differences in body fat. And these people didn't leave the lab. They had their foods perfectly prepared for themselves. So that kind of science just completely destroys the notion that it's just based off of this mechanism of insulin. It doesn't work that way. So then that raises the question, well, then why? How? Right? And it's one of the big reasons is because insulin still drops. Even when you're consuming carbohydrates, but you're in a calorie deficit, guess what? Your insulin levels drop. So it's relative to what you would be consuming to maintain your weight. No matter the diet composition, if you are dropping your calories below your maintenance threshold, below the amount that it would take to maintain your body weight, your insulin levels drop, point blank. So yes, they may drop more with a lower carbohydrate diet, but ultimately it still doesn't lead to any changes in body fat. And I think people get so focused on insulin, and I understand why, because insulin is such a powerful hormone. And I don't think this other hormone is ever going to get nearly as much notoriety, so much attention. But there are other research labs that have discovered, I think in like the 1980s or 1990s maybe, they've discovered other hormones that lead to fat accumulation, that do exactly what insulin does, but they are stimulated. Here's the amazing thing. Here's the kicker. That's another expression I don't get. Here's the kicker. Okay. Those studies indicate that it's just that hormone is stimulated by the consumption of fat and not stimulated by the consumption of carbohydrates. So it's the exact opposite of what insulin does. So the more fat you consume, the more of this other hormone called ASP, I think it's acylation stimulating protein, or acylating stimulating acylation, I think, stimulating protein. I have a few older videos. I really need to refresh those videos, and I will. But there isn't as much data on that hormone. There are several studies on it that all indicate that that's what it does. But it's a tricky hormone to study. Why? Because it's secreted, I believe, if I remember correctly, it's secreted by your fat cells. And the fat cells will interact with this hormone in what's known as an autocrine or paracrine fashion. So it's not, while it does have endocrine fashion, so as in, yes, it goes into the entire system of your body, it has specific effects to the nearby tissues of your body. So let's say a fat cell sucks up a bunch of fat because that's all it's being fed from the intestines, right? You're consuming a lot of fat. You're consuming virtually no carbohydrates. The fat enters the bloodstream, goes through the bloodstream, enters into the fat cells because the fat cells take it up. Believe it or not, just because you're not consuming carbohydrates doesn't mean that the fat gets to chill in your bloodstream. It has to get sucked up into your fat cells regardless. Admittedly, though, your fat cells do burn more fat. Your cells in general burn more fat, which is the big argument of keto. But with that take up of that fat, that also stimulates the release of this particular hormone, which also exacerbates the uptake of fat from other fat cells. So, and it's difficult because I think like the half-life of this hormone is really short. There are really tiny quantities of this hormone, so the sensitivity of your cells has to be really high. I mean, things like that. It's been a number of years since I've covered it, so I don't remember all the details. But then they tested it with carbohydrates, and carbohydrates had zero effect. Didn't stimulate this hormone, but fat specifically did. So, and it led to fat storage. So, I mean, it's that kind of stuff. It's just like, people focus so much on insulin, and rightly so. I 100% acknowledge that insulin is one of the major hormones, but it isn't the only one. And physiology, shockingly, I mean, I know a lot of people people talk with so much confidence when they're commenting and whatnot. It's like, it's the insulin. It's like, okay, sure. There's certainly no more to physiology than just this one hormone. And there's just a lot of complexity there. But ultimately, that would be an added explanation as to why there would be no differences in fat consumption, or in fat loss, I should say, between the two groups. So, okay, so then another question that people were bringing up to me is like, okay, well, that's all well and good, Nick, but is it different if you're insulin resistant? That's a pretty good question. I really like that question. I thought to myself, okay, this should be pretty easy to tease out as well. So I dug into the literature and found a number of different studies that looked at diabetic individuals, so people that definitely have full-blown insulin resistance, and compared them against people that don't have insulin resistance. So there's a really small meta-analysis that was actually brought to my attention by Dr. Lane Norton. And I ended up reanalyzing all of those studies. And I found one study that had some discrepancies in it, or I shouldn't say discrepancies, but confounding variables. And I addressed those in the video that I released. But ultimately, across all the studies, it was pretty clear, well, I would say extremely clear, that fat loss was completely uninhibited. Like, as long as you were in a calorie deficit, it did not matter. You were going to lose the exact same amount of weight as a person who's not insulin resistant. And then I thought to myself, well, why not also answer this question of, it does a low carbohydrate diet that specifically lowers insulin, maybe even more than a calorie deficit alone with higher carbohydrates, would you see greater fat loss in an insulin resistant person specifically? And I showed a number of studies that compared low carb diets versus higher carbohydrate diets. These aren't like perfect studies. They're not studies that are perfect in regard of like these low carbohydrate people consume 20 grams and the high carbohydrate consume 900 grams of carbohydrates. It's not that huge of discrepancies, but it was at least double to 3 times more carbohydrates in the higher carbohydrate group. So you should be able to tell a difference in insulin if that truly is the effect. And again, regardless of the diet that people were on, over weeks, months, I think one was 2 years long, something, or a year long, there were no differences in body fat loss in insulin-resistant people that were put on either diet. Both groups lost the same amount of body fat. So again, that speaks to no, insulin resistance is not holding you back in that mechanism. To be clear, because I would never sit here and arrogantly state that insulin resistance doesn't create hardships that aren't independent of what I'm talking about. And I made that clear in the video as well. I was like, I understand that there are other complexities that people experience that make it more difficult to lose body fat, to stick to their nutrition, to consume carbohydrates. You know, maybe they consume carbohydrates, they feel less full as an insulin resistant individual. I have not investigated that. So can I speak to that? No, I can't. I haven't read the research yet. I will. But the specific idea, though, that it's because you have high blood insulin and you are insensitive, you are resistant to that high blood insulin, that is the reason you can't lose body fat through the mechanism of insulin stops body fat loss. That is not true. That is proven across the multitude of studies that I show in that video, and I'm sure plenty of other studies as well, that specific mechanism is again not true. Just like it's not true for non-insulin sensitive or non-insulin resistant, I should say, people that I showed in the previous video. It does come down to calories to lose body fat, regardless of your diet. Now, that said, I received a comment that I thought was quite good, and I'd like to address it because it speaks to the other aspects of things. So this person this person is named ZS. That's all I have, all the information I have. So thank you, ZS, for writing. This is not a person who, I think their first language is not English, but I thought it was a great point, and I wanted to bring it up. And I wanted to address a few things here. So ZS says, I'm going to add a few like grammar things in here just to make it more understandable, but hopefully ZS doesn't mind. Point is that it is easier to lose weight on low carb keto for many people. Me too, I'm less hungry. That's what this person says. All that insulin discussion is irrelevant, and I would like to touch on that. It's just academic discussion for sake of discussion. I understand why you debunking insulin is bad make you lose weight less. So insulin bad is because it makes you lose less weight. But really the only thing that is important is how to lose weight and not starving. Maybe you can make a video about that. Sorry for my English. So ZS, your English is very good. So there's a few points here. The point is that it's easier to lose weight on a low-carb keto for many people. I don't deny. I'm not denying that. Like I don't. The point of these kinds of videos is, I guess, to your point in a way, it's an academic discussion for the sake of discussion. I don't agree with that necessarily, because, well, I'll back up for a second. Let's talk about keto and satiety and whatnot. I think I get flooded with comments of people saying that their body fat melted off when they went on a low carb diet. am I going to sit here and say, oh, no, it didn't? No, of course not. Your experience is your experience. And if you had a much easier time losing body fat on a keto or low carb diet, then I'm not going to deny that. Like, congratulations. And I acknowledge that. And I think there's probably some explanations for that. One of them I can tell you, which I'm going to address a little bit later on as we get into the carbohydrate-insulin model as well, is to mention that a ketogenic diet typically increases, or it definitely does increase your ketone levels. So your blood ketone levels increase, and blood ketones have an effect on satiety. I don't know, I haven't looked into the mechanism, but I'm assuming it affects specifically the hypothalamus and therefore modulates the hunger hormone that get released in the hypothalamus, which are related to POMC neurons, NPY neurons, and the exchange of neuropeptide Y, AGRP, and melanocyte stimulating hormone, something like that. I could be off on that last one. MSH of some sort. So the modulation of those hormones ultimately leads to it interacting with other neurons in our brain, which tell us I'm hungry, I'm not hungry. And ketones probably have an effect on that mechanism because that is the main mechanism by which we experience hunger or not hunger. And so in a higher carbohydrate diet does not have that effect. So it's possible that the ketones, and I would say probably likely, even though I have not evaluated this research myself, this is just based off of reading from scientific reviews, which of course I'm trusting these experts in this field to know what they're talking about, that's probably one of the mechanisms. The other one is related to something I'll discuss once I get to the carbohydrate-insulin model, which has been something that I've changed my mind on. If you've been following me for those videos that I've been releasing on that, I have changed my mind on one aspect about insulin, which stay tuned for more. That's coming up in the other half of this podcast. But I don't want to deny that it's easier to lose body fat for some people. I've also heard from plenty of people they have a much easier time losing body fat on a higher carbohydrate diet, and they have a horrible time in a low carb diet. My stance has always been just do what's sustainable. You're always going to hear that from me. Do the thing that's the most sustainable. It doesn't matter how optimal a diet is. If you can't stick to it, then it's completely the least optimal for you. So I think that a ketogenic diet can have some serious benefits in that regard. I think it helps a lot of people. I'm not denying that. I think it can be more advantageous than a higher carbohydrate diet for certain people. But I would like to push back on this notion that all that insulin discussion is irrelevant. It's just academic discussion for the sake of discussion. I just cannot disagree with that more. And the reason for that is because if you start losing body fat on a ketogenic diet and you start blaming it on insulin, your whole framework of how you think about food is based on insulin. So you're going to start looking at that mechanism for everything that you do. Can I have this food? Can I not have this food? Or if you need to, somebody asks you, let's say somebody asks you, wow, Ralph, you've lost 30 kilograms, 60, 70 something pounds on a ketogenic diet. How does that work for you? Like, how are you doing that? And then they start explaining the mechanism, and then somebody asks them a follow-up question, and you don't know how to respond because you don't actually understand the physiology of what's happening to your body. That means you are an uneducated person that thinks that they're educated, but you don't actually understand the intricacies of what's happening inside your body. And getting those baseline mechanisms, again, I think the number one thing is to look at the outcome. That's the main thing to look out for. But if you really want to be an educated person, You have to understand the mechanisms. And you don't have to just understand the mechanisms on this razor thin path, but you have to understand a little bit on either side as well, so that if you're questioned by somebody, in one scenario, if you're questioned by somebody, that you are able to fit that into your framework and say, okay, it would work by maybe having an effect on these cells, or, whatever it might be. And I realize that's a certain level of education that takes some work. It definitely takes some work, but I do think that is incredibly important for that factor. But the more important factor is if you go out to eat or whatever it might be, and you have this idea implanted in your head of it's because of insulin that I can't consume X food. And it turns out that you can have that food and still reach perfect success, that you are affecting your mental health. You're affecting your social relationships. You're affecting so many different aspects of your life just because of one infectious idea that is completely incorrect. Think about that. So yes, education matters, and the mechanisms and understanding what is correct and what is not correct is vital. Not just because of intellect, of academic discussion. You'll have to excuse me if I get a little passionate about this, because I think it's a wonderful comment, and thank you for posting it. I just disagree with this idea that, well, we should only be focused on the outcome. Just tell me how to lose weight. Because I'm not going to go to a harsh level that I sometimes think. I'm just going to say that I think that it's doing you a disservice to simply think about just getting to that outcome. Just tell me how to get to that outcome. I don't care about anything else, because it puts you on this island with no way to get off. And it would be great to have the multiple paths, or a huge path to get to. Now it's not an island, obviously, it's a peninsula, so that you know how to go in and out continuously, because your framework just understands how to get in and out of that intellectual situation. And I cannot express to you how much that made a difference in my own life. The more I educated myself, the more I knew the science, the more I tested it on myself after learning the science with sample sizes of hundreds and thousands of people. I would test these things on myself, and I would be blown away by the fact that the accuracy of that information. And then once I knew this information, knew the mechanisms, somebody who asked me a question, I'd be like, oh, that's because I can explain that. That's fit into my framework. That's because of this, or it's because of this. And if they would ask me a question that I didn't know the answer to, I'd be thinking, I wonder how that fits into my framework. Maybe I need to investigate this further, and maybe I need to change my framework if it doesn't fit into my framework. But it bolsters you with so much information. It's like a plate of armor that gives you such security when it comes to your nutrition, that it's just it's a powerful, powerful thing to have on your side. So no, I don't think that it's just academic discussion. All right, let's move on. Carbohydrate-Insulin model. Let me have some coffee real quick. All right, the Carbohydrate-Insulin model. So this was a discussion back and forth between two groups of researchers. The researchers are Dr. David Ludwig, and the other one on the opposite end is Dr. Kevin Hall. And Dr. David Ludwig espouses the carbohydrate-insulin model, and Kevin Hall espouses the conventional model. And the carbohydrate-insulin model sort of speaks to a little bit of what I was talking about, the insulin myth. but it adds significant intricacies, significant added effects. So this is where I changed one aspect of my mind. I used to think that things were a lot more clear cut, and they are pretty much clear cut in my mind still. But this is kind of a great example. This is an example of me shifting my framework a little bit because I encountered some research that ultimately just it fit into my framework, but it would have fit in my framework a little bit better if I shifted a certain aspect of my framework. Hopefully, the ambulance and the fire department and the police department that you're hearing right now isn't distracting. So, unfortunately, I can't stop that. That's just the way it is. So let me describe what this is. So again, this is a back and forth. It got pretty heated. I mean, not disrespectful or anything, but it got pretty heated back and forth in the scientific community between the conventional model researchers and the carbohydrate-insulin model researchers. So I've got a more detailed breakdown of all this, but I'm going to give you kind of the highlights and some of the key points that I think are really important, which of course is biased. So the idea of the carbohydrate-insulin model, I've got an image here so I can describe it a little more accurately, is in the reverse order of the conventional model plus an added flavor. What do I mean by that? It means that you eat dietary carbohydrates and that leads to an increase in insulin secretion. We've covered that. That's true. No denying that. That then leads to an increase in fat storage. That increase in fat storage reduces the circulating metabolic fuels. Let me explain that. So when you consume carbohydrates, let's say you consume a meal, you consume, let's say, 100 grams of carbohydrates plus 20 grams of protein plus 30 grams of fat. Those all get taken up into your intestines, they get broken down, and then they get shuttled into your bloodstream. The carbohydrates then stimulate the insulin levels from your pancreas. The insulin is now floating in with the metabolic substrates, with the fats, with the carbohydrates, with the protein, the amino acids, floating into the bloodstream, and those then connect to the insulin receptors on fat cells. The fat cells then open up, in kind of a broad term, they open up and they allow those fats and the amino acids and some of the carbohydrates and whatnot into the fat cells. This ultimately enlarges the fat cells, but downstream of the fat cells, the muscle cells, the kidney cells, the brain cells, all these other cells that make up the other tissues are now starving because all those nutrients have been sucked up by the fat cells, making the fat cells larger. As such, this drop in circulating nutrients then signals the brain, oh, we're starving, even though the fat cells have gotten larger, and therefore that triggers more consumption. So that triggers hunger, and then we consume more. And then it's a perpetual cycle of the fat cells continuing to grow, and we continue to feel hungry. Okay. Now, the idea then is if you were to not consume carbohydrates, then you would then drop the insulin levels, as you know, and then you wouldn't have this shuttling into the fat cells. Those nutrients would bypass the fat cells and go to the other tissues and feed those tissues, and therefore you don't have that hunger signal that's being perpetuated by the brain. God, I mean, hey, that makes a lot of sense to me. It makes a lot of sense. I think it's nonsense, but it makes a lot of sense in the sense, it's nonsense in the fact that I understand so much more of the research, so I can say that doesn't make any sense because I've looked at the research and there's a lot of contradictory information to that model. But If you don't know the research and you look at your own experience, especially if you've jumped on a ketogenic diet, for example, and you start to lose a lot of body fat and whatnot, and you're thinking, wow, I'm never hungry and whatnot. The problem is you now have two correlates going at the same time. You have two things that could be leading to the result that you're seeing, but you're attributing it. You now know this information and you're attributing your results to this information. And that's why you need people that will break down the science and explain different things in such a way that you get an education from the macro to the micro, so that you can dispel certain things and accept certain other things. Obviously, there's still a bias factor there, which is something is difficult to address. But so the two correlates would be, okay, I jumped on a ketogenic diet. I lost a lot of body fat and I never feel hungry. I hear the carbohydrate-insulin model and I think, wow, that makes a lot of sense. That's exactly my experience. I drop carbohydrates. Most likely I drop my insulin levels. Therefore, my cells aren't starving and they're not being taken up by the fat cells because I'm losing body fat. Great. That makes sense. But on the other hand, there's another correlate in something that I described earlier. Ketogenic diet, low carbohydrate diet, also increases your ketone levels, makes you less hungry. So now we have two different ways of thinking about it. And one of them has a bunch of holes in it that you're not aware of. And the other one is simplistic. I'll give you that. And I think that I need to educate myself further on that mechanism, but I think that there are other mechanisms that are probably involved that I don't know about. That once I start investigating into what drives hunger or what drives lower hunger in a ketogenic diet, I'll be able to flesh that out more. Additionally, I think that it's perfectly possible there's another explanation that I'm not thinking of at the moment, or maybe I don't have enough information to come up with anything. So, but what I do know quite conclusively is that there's a lot of research that goes completely against and drives massive holes in the carbohydrate-insulin model. Okay, so let's discuss the conventional model now, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to go a little bit back and forth. So the conventional model then describes that it's more of what you've heard before. So overeating leads to an increase in energy intake. So just like caloric intake, energy intake, which leads to an increase in the circulating metabolic fuels. So the carbohydrates, the fats, the proteins, etc., increase because you've overconsumed for that day. And if you do that day in, day out, over and over and over on average, then that means that you get more of that gets stored into those fat depots, the fat cells. Okay, fair enough. But then that doesn't explain the hunger aspect. And that's because that's a really simplistic explanation of the overall idea. What's also an addition is the fact that the brain is the main mediator of your hunger. And when you start to lose body weight, your body starts to fight back against that. Your leptin levels drop, your ghrelin levels will change, those hormones, those brain hormones that I mentioned, the neuropeptide Y and AGRP and et cetera, those will start to increase, leading to increases in want for food and hunger. Your glucagon levels change. There's a lot of different hormonal factors that certainly play a role. Your insulin levels certainly drop, which insulin can also be a satiety hormone in the short term. So there's a lot there that changes, but ultimately it's the brain that's the mediator. And that would happen regardless. But of course, if you don't do a low carbohydrate diet, then you don't have the advantage of the ketones, of like the significantly elevated ketones, therefore stopping or blunting some of those hunger effects. So that model there's more complexity to it than I can even get into here. But ultimately, like for example, like the discussion of calories, which really sets some people off. I know some people were, I think I made fun of that fact in one of my videos recently. And because I didn't want to say the dreaded calorie word, so I said energy balance. Because, you know, a lot of people just don't understand calories, which I'm actually going to touch on a little bit in just a second. But the conventional model is essentially that you're over-consuming, and the main culprit of overconsumption, according to the conventional model, is really ultra-processed foods. It's the food environment. They also mention like maybe if you have brain damage, but that's like what, less than 1% of the population. If you like have traumatic brain injury or whatever to a specific region of your brain, your regulatory systems don't work as well anymore. Like that's a whole different thing. Genetics is another factor, absolutely. But the main one that would affect the most people would be the amount of processed foods, like the fact that, you know, they've made food more and more palatable, hyper palatable over time, to the point where if you consume a serving of chips, you don't feel satisfied at all. So the combination of the salts plus the salts plus the fats plus like a number of other molecules that they've probably put in there to make sure that it's as enjoyable, you get as much of a reward as possible from it, leads to the overconsumption, especially if you're not getting much filling from it. And their argument, as just one of their anecdotes, is like, well, who's over-consuming on broccoli? No one is, because doesn't taste that great. Even if you were to make it taste the best possible, you would still stop consuming that way before you'd stop consuming like salt and vinegar chips, unless you hate salt and vinegar chips. Chips in general, crisps for the English audience. So that's their main argument. And again, I'd certainly encourage that you watch the video, because I go into more detail. And even then I was a little frustrated with myself because I completely forgot a few different elements that I should have added. So let's go back to the carbohydrate-insulin model. They end up presenting a bunch of research in favor of their perspective. Like they use some animal studies where they injected insulin into these animals, and then the animals ended up gaining body fat. And that is not something I would debate. Like absolutely, if you inject insulin into someone, they start to gain weight. Think about like type 1 diabetics. If they don't have insulin, they lose fat really fast, because they don't have one of those hormones that's driving the uptake of nutrients into the fat cells, and they'll die very quickly if they don't have insulin. So, but then when they start injecting insulin, suddenly all those nutrients that are found within the bloodstream get sucked up out of the bloodstream. Because think about it, like if you're a type 1 diabetic, and I realize I'm talking mechanisms here, so it would have to bear out in the outcome research as well. But if you're type 1 diabetic that's unregulated, like you just have, you will have completely blown out levels of nutrients in your bloodstream. So all the stuff that should be in your fat cells that should be normally regulated by insulin, pushing those nutrients into the fat cells and keeping your bloodstream within a certain strict baseline of each nutrient, blood sugar, triglycerides, et cetera, all of that is now in your bloodstream, which is incredibly dangerous and in very short order will cause some serious problems. So none of that is being taken up by your fat cells. And as a matter of fact, your fat cells may even be dumping more into your bloodstream. So you're withering away, but then you inject insulin, the miracle insulin, and suddenly all those molecules that are found in that bloodstream get sucked up into the fat cells. That makes you start to gain weight. That starts to make you, well, I shouldn't even say weight, because technically the molecules aren't suddenly coming from outside of your body into your body, therefore increasing your weight. The molecules are already there, but it does increase your body fat. So your body fat starts to increase because you can measure the fat that's inside the tissues because it's been removed from the bloodstream and moved into the tissues. So, and if you look at that study that they reference, that's exactly what happens. The animals that were fed the same diet that did not get injected with insulin, they got injected with saline, so an inert, supposedly inert substance, essentially not insulin, they did not gain body fat, or they gained some body fat, but not nearly as much as the insulin injected animals. But the insulin injected animals, their blood sugar levels were less than half of what the other animals were. And some of their other like blood markers were reduced as well. So that goes to this kind of idea that I have, which is unproven. This is just me spitballing based off of my physiology knowledge, that the molecules have been sucked into the fat cells. But if they had injected more insulin, the animals would die because the blood levels have to stay within a certain range. And if once you get too low, especially with something like blood sugar, you end up in a coma and you end up dying. So there's a lot there. And that doesn't actually prove anything towards the carbohydrate-insulin model. I don't think even people that believe in the conventional model would disagree with any. Everybody knows that insulin does that. That if you inject insulin into somebody, they start gaining body fat. No, nobody's debating that. But you can't do that you can't do that in perpetuity without them consuming nutrients from the outside of their body, like actual food on their plate, because otherwise they'll die. So it's this constant balance of insulin and consumption of nutrients because they have to be within a certain range. Otherwise, if you over inject insulin, you die because your nutrients drop in your bloodstream so low that your cells don't have the nutrients that they need and you end up in a coma and die. Or if you have too many nutrients and you don't inject enough insulin, then you can cause all kinds of problems across your system, because in that situation, you've got all these nutrients that are stuck in the bloodstream and not moving into the tissues. So you're not going to be living much longer from that as well. So it's this constant back and forth. And we see that in type 1 diabetics. Based on the limited research that I've gone into, I need to look more into type 1 diabetes as well. So, and we see that with uncontrolled type 2 diabetes as well. So in really late stages of type 2 diabetes, you may have to start injecting insulin because at that point, your pancreas is simply not producing enough. It simply cannot produce. Your insulin resistance is so high that the insulin levels in your bloodstream are so high that your pancreas can no longer produce that level of insulin. And therefore, you need to put even more insulin into your bloodstream. And the reason you can do that is because your cells are actually resistant and don't have sensitivity to the molecule insulin. So you have to use even more insulin to get the same effect that you would normally get, like at 1/10 the level of insulin, or a 1/5 or half or whatever it might be if you were insulin sensitive. So yeah, there's that was one of the issues. Another issue that they had brought up is that there were these animals that they had fed where they were on I think it was, I suppose, a low glycemic index diet versus a high glycemic index diet. I think I'm remembering it correctly. And they were comparing between the two, and they had determined that with the low glycemic index diet, with the high glycemic index, they had specifically reduced their caloric consumption. They had forced the animals to consume fewer calories to control their body weight. And they had found that those animals had still gained more body fat than the low glycemic index food consuming animals. So low glycemic, if you're not familiar, would be like more complex carbohydrates, as opposed to like high glycemic, which would be like sugars and things of that nature, simple carbohydrates. And there's some nuance there. And honestly, when it comes to like glycemic index, it probably should only be applied to people that are diabetic or pre-diabetic maybe, because typically if you pair foods with the glycemic index carbohydrates, it completely changes the absorption. So because glycemic index is just determined based off of the food in isolation. So like a simple sugar in isolation, what happens, how fast does it get absorbed, and how quickly does it lead to an insulin response? So the study on its own already has limited value. It'll speak to glycemic index, but it won't really speak to really anything else. So anyway, let's just put that aside for a moment. They found that the high glycemic index consuming animals ended up gaining more body fat. And they were like, what? But we controlled their intake. So it clearly can't be calories because we controlled their intake. And then they just had one sentence in their discussion where they were like, we admit that we didn't actually measure their expenditure, which may be the reason why there were differences between these groups. It's like, yeah, you think you can't say that this is a proof of that calories don't matter if you're going to not purposefully, but if you're going to ignore the other half of the equation. There's two parts of that equation. There's the intake and the expenditure part of that equation. So if you control for the intake part roughly, but you don't control for the expenditure part of that, like physical activity and whatnot, I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. Like you can still look at the data and say for what it is, like high glycemic index may lead to more fat gain or whatever it might be. But I would really like to see how these animals ended up running, because I always forget this. It's like day-night cycles with rats. I think this one was in rats. With rats and with mice, actually, probably even more with mice. They are extremely active, I think either at night and less active during the day, or it's reverse. But it's like huge differences in their activity level. So if you don't measure their activity, which they are super active, then you're not addressing a huge variable. So, and then if you looked at their lean mass, so one of the huge components of lean mass is muscle mass, and their lean mass was less as well than the low glycemic index animals. So that would indicate to me maybe they were less physically active and they lost muscle mass as a result. I'm just saying that's a possibility. I'm not saying that's definitely the case, because that's not. Lean mass is an overarching measure. It's a measure of fat, or not fat, fat-free mass. It's a measure of muscle. It's a measure of bone. It's a measure of glycogen. It's a measure. So it could be any number of those different things. But if it is a loss of lean mass, that would really strongly indicate to me that there's a potential problem with these animals. Like they're not moving nearly as much, which would dramatically change the energy expenditure part of that equation. So that wasn't exactly great evidence for their point. Then there was another one where they said they cited a study where they looked at the insulin secretion levels. So they cited a study where the researchers had recruited people and then had them consume a low carbohydrate diet or a higher carbohydrate diet. And they had controlled for the processing of the foods. They had mentioned to consume healthier foods, like they had met with like a dietitian and whatnot to figure out what were like healthier foods and things of that nature. And then from there, they had segmented these people into 3 different categories: low insulin secreting individuals, like middle insulin secreting individuals, and high insulin secreting individuals. So they wanted to determine if the level of insulin secretion, genetically based, would have an effect on the overall weight loss. And what they found was there was no difference. But what was interesting is the carbohydrate-insulin model researchers cited this study and said they lost more weight, but it was non-significant. And that's not how you would write that. You would write that as there were no differences in weight loss, and because there was no statistically significant difference between the two. There's a difference between those two sentences. One of them is preempting you by saying, yes, they lost more weight. It just happened to not be statistically significant. The other one is saying they did not lose more weight. They did not lose. There was no difference in weight loss, and because it was not statistically significant. And any researcher would typically go with the latter, because you shouldn't really be reporting things like that. Like you can't, because essentially what they were doing is like looking at it and saying, well, they lost, I don't know how much it was. Like if you looked at just the raw numbers, it was just like maybe half a kilogram more weight over the time. The low carbohydrate diet lost half a kilogram more weight. But statistically, the statistical comparison, which takes into consideration variance between the two groups, would be taking into consideration more aspects like the sample size, the variance, the standard error of the mean, things of that nature, which all play together, and determined that there was no difference. And typically researchers, they look at the statistical significance to determine, should I be trusting my eye? But they just said, we trust our eyes more than the statistical analysis. I mean, what? I was what? The way it was written, I remember I leaned back and I literally had the reaction I'm having now. Like, what? You can't write it that way. Like, that is such a crafty, I gotta say, that is a crafty way of writing that. And what was really funny to me is that the conventional model researchers, when they responded to the overall review by the carbohydrate-insulin model researchers, they also cited that study, but they cited as a proof of their perspective. So both sides were using the same study, and they were saying that it was proof for their model. That makes zero sense to me whatsoever. And I really think the carbohydrate-insulin model researchers were not just stretching, they were just like a whole nother planet with the way they were describing the results of that study. But they used that as evidence of their perspective as well. And then there were other studies where they pointed out like a single piece of data in that study, but then if you looked at other aspects of that data, there was like evidence that their model didn't make any sense. I'll give you another example. I guess this is a podcast, so I don't really have to be sitting here worried about time. But one of the descriptions that they used, and this is something I wanted to discuss earlier, that I teased earlier, that with the ketogenic diet, there's a potential that there's an increase in metabolism, that there's an overall increase in metabolism, which is one of the areas that I actually changed my mind on, which I'm really fascinated by, and I'm definitely going to be investigating this further, because it would be an interesting added benefit of a low-carb diet. So anyway, so they cite this animal study. This one was in mice, if I remember correctly. I'm pretty sure it was. And where they compared animals that were on a conventional, like high carbohydrate, it was like 50% carbohydrate, really high. And then a ketogenic diet. They put the other animals on a ketogenic diet. Okay. And then they looked at the overall temperature. So they used heat as their measure of metabolic rate. And that's a great measure. That's called direct calorimetry. So they are measuring, dare I say the word, calories because even the carbohydrate-insulin model is measuring calories, shockingly. They used a caloric measure to essentially say that calories, I don't know if they would necessarily say calories don't matter. I think they just undervalue calories. I think that's really it. So I think I'll give them the benefit of the doubt there. So they use this direct calorimetry, which is a measure of heat, because calories is a measure of heat. And I get that some people, because they don't understand calories, they immediately say, well, see, that has nothing to do with metabolism, it has nothing to do with nutrition. And it's like, I'm not going to go into it right now, but you just have no idea what you're talking about. That it's just plain as that, like plain as day. You just don't know what you're talking about. And I will be releasing a video to explain that. I've been thinking really hard about how I can make this as abundantly clear as I can possibly make it, because I am stunned by how many people just don't understand what calories are. And they completely create false equivalencies all over the place. I mean, all over the place. It's nuts to me. Anyway, so they measured metabolism, and they found that with the ketogenic diet fed mice, those mice experienced a slight increase in their metabolism as measured by an overall elevated heat expenditure. Now, as far as I know, that wasn't due to physical activity. I should have probably checked that, but because that could be a confounding variable. But let's assume that it wasn't, just for this argument. So that was good proof. Okay, great. So the lowering carbohydrates would then increase your metabolic rate. Fine. But then the next point that they had after that, so then they just left it at that. And I looked at the other data from that study, and I was thinking to myself, wasn't one of their points is that if you don't consume carbohydrates, then you'll be far less hungry, so you'll be consuming less in general? And so then I was like, okay, because low carbohydrates, low insulin levels, all the nutrients get to suck up all the stuff that they need. So therefore the brain is going to get signals of we're full, we're good on energy. And therefore you don't get this propagation of hunger. And yet if you look at the consumption, the food consumption on all these animals, they're the exact same. And as a matter of fact, you could even argue the ketogenic diet animals consumed a little bit more than the other animals. It wasn't statistically significant, so I don't want to do what they did with the previous study. So I'm just going to say there was no differences across the board. But then that would go against their model in the very study that they're citing as proof of their model. Again. I don't like, to me, that's just, it's stunning. It's like selectively just looking at single pieces of data and not acknowledging some of the discrepancies that data also brings with it. So I hope that you're getting a sense of why I'm so skeptical about, or where I'm not even skeptical. I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it. It doesn't make sense. The model is being presented and then it doesn't make sense across multiple lines of research. And I haven't even had to bring in some of my own counter research. I can just look at the research that they're mentioning and just, it indicates that's not the case. And another thing I forgot to mention is with the high glycemic and low glycemic, those are both carbohydrates. So they both stimulate insulin, maybe to like at varying speeds like of release of insulin, but they still release insulin. So why didn't both sets of animals in the previous study that I was describing, like both of them increase the amount of body fat that they had on them to an equal amount? It's just, there's so many inconsistencies there. And that's not even all of them. That's certainly not all of them. Okay. But before I go back to the conventional model, I did want to mention something that the carbohydrate-insulin model researchers pointed out. So I'm going to read this from their review, and I'm going to talk about it. It's about calories, which I've teased I'd talk about. Indeed, a recent scientific statement from the Endocrine Society concludes that the answer to the question, Is a calorie is yes. In other words, diets high in added sugar or other processed carbohydrates should have no special adverse effects upon metabolism or body composition after considering total calorie consumption. However, rates of obesity remain intractably high despite, and then the rest of it cuts off. But the main part that I'm interested in is, okay, they mention the Endocrine Society concludes that a calorie is a calorie. And then they interpret it as, in other words, diets high in added sugar or other processed carbohydrates should have no special adverse negative effects upon metabolism or body composition. That is not what the calorie method is talking about. Calories are a unit of energy that describe the chemical reactions that are happening within our body, like the enzymatic reactions that are happening within our body. Nobody would deny that consuming high amounts of sugar don't have an effect on your body. They can have an effect through your hormones. They can have an effect through having specific effects on your mitochondria or whatever it might be. Like, there's a number of different ways that eating processed foods can affect you to the point where you can still experience negative effects that are independent of calories. Calories in, calories out can still be true. And the foods themselves, if they come from ultra processed or not processed, if you were to compare them, they can still have divergent effects. They can still have like the ultra processed can still have negative effects on your body, your satiety, on your mental health, your overall metabolic health. And the calories of those foods can still be equivalent. And I'm not going to go into more depth on that, but that's why I'm saying I really need to release a video that explains this to some extreme depth, because it's those kinds of statements that make it abundantly clear that a lot of people just don't seem to be able to separate the nature of a food, the molecule itself, from the caloric yield of that food. Those are two very closely linked, but they are fundamentally independent of one another. Although in certain respects, they are dependent on one another. But there's a point in the metabolic process where they become independent of one another. And that's what I need to tease out, because people just don't seem to get it, which I don't blame them, because I don't feel like anybody's explained it well. Okay, I'm just going to stop it at that. So anyway, the conventional model researchers then ended up releasing this meta-analysis of like 27 studies or something like that, where they compared 27 studies comparing low carbohydrate diets versus high carbohydrate diets. And they wanted to look at two different measures. They looked at metabolism, so the overall metabolism, and they looked at the body fat loss, so the amount of body fat loss. And they concluded that there was maybe a slight benefit towards high carb diets in both, that you saw slightly more body fat loss on a high carb diet and slightly higher caloric yield in a high carb diet. But they ultimately ended up saying, yeah, I mean, technically there's an effect of like, I don't remember exactly what it was, like 12 calories. But is that actually like fundamental? Does that make any real world difference? No. So they said both diets are equivalent. Like, you can lose body fat and have the same caloric expenditure on both diets. So that was really fascinating. Admittedly, I wasn't a huge fan of that meta-analysis because I didn't feel like they went through, which I probably should have mentioned, but they didn't go into any of the like bias assessments. I didn't get much of a background on any of the studies that they had mentioned. Usually you'd want to do what's called a JADAD scale, so JADAD scale, which indicates some level of like, is it randomized? Is it an open trial? Is it placebo controlled? Is it like, there's a number of different statements that you have to check off to follow the JADAD scale. But as far as I remember, I don't think they did that. They did some stuff in the supplementary material and publication bias, if I remember correctly, but I could be off on that as well. So ultimately, I felt like it was a little bare bones in terms of the meta-analysis. So that would be one of my critiques of the conventional model researchers on this meta-analysis. But anyway, that was their conclusion. And then the carbohydrate insulin model researchers, to their credit, came back and reanalyzed that analysis, that meta-analysis, and ended up including 3 more studies. I think they excluded like 2 studies and included 3 more studies because this was a few years later, so a few more studies had come out. Okay, so with that in mind, then they reanalyzed the data and they ended up discovering something really intriguing, which ultimately changed my mind about something in favor of the carbohydrate insulin model. I shouldn't say that. I don't believe the carbohydrate insulin model. I think it's bunk. But I think that the researchers from that believe in that model had a point that I hadn't considered, that I didn't know, that now I'm leaning towards agreeing with them on that one point. But I still don't believe their model. And I'll explain why. The mechanism for why I think that they may be right, based on their outcome data that I'm about to tell you about. So they reanalyzed all 27 studies, removed, I think, 2 of them, and then added 3 that had come out. And they, with their reanalysis, they ended up indicating, okay, the median, it's not really the average, but let's just call it the average. The average, because that's the most common term in kind of colloquial language. The median or semi-average number of days that the studies ran were only 4 days long. So that means the majority of the studies were either around 4 days or shorter in length. And clearly that's incredibly short. So they pointed this out. And they ultimately said, well, okay, if you just separate the studies out by studies that lasted 17 days or less, then yes, we agree with you. There's no difference in metabolism from a low-carb diet versus a higher carbohydrate diet. But if you look at the studies that lasted longer than 17 days, there suddenly is a benefit of the low carbohydrate diet. Like the low carbohydrate diet experiences an increase in metabolism. So, and that was according to like 5 or 6 studies. It wasn't like a whole lot, but it was all the studies showed this effect, which was pretty intriguing. And then they ended up mentioning it's like a 50 calorie boost in metabolism per 10% drop in carbohydrate intake. Now, somebody commented and said on one of my shorts, I think, and said, well, that means that if you do a 100% drop in carbohydrates, then that would mean that you'd be getting a 500 calorie boost. And actually, these researchers in another study had mentioned something, maybe not quite that extreme, but pretty close, like 350 calorie increase or something like that. But that's not how we calculate that. You would calculate that as like if your diet is 50% carbohydrates. Nobody's diet is 100% carbohydrates. If that's the case, you're dead. So that's not real. But if a person's diet is pretty high in carbohydrates, 50% carbohydrates, and you drop it down to near zero, that's 5. So that's like around 250 calories boost in metabolism, according to these researchers. So they ended up giving a range of like 100 maybe 70 calories. I can't remember the exact numbers, up to like 250 calories in this scenario that I'm describing. However, the conventional model researchers then came back and reanalyzed the reanalysis of their analysis and ended up saying, well, hold on. You used certain mathematical assumptions that we can't technically use, and they were going back and forth about using doubly labeled water versus calorimetry. And there's just a bunch of arguments that gets into some really scientific specifics that I'm not going to bog you down with. But they essentially disagreed on the methods by which they ended up calculating these numbers. And they recalculated it with some assumptions that they didn't want to make, but they had to make because they didn't have all the data that the carbohydrate-insulin model reanalysis had used. So with some assumptions, they ended up agreeing that there is maybe an effect with longer consumption of a low carbohydrate diet. And they end up mentioning that, it's not a 150 or 250 or 500 calorie boost. It's very much more modest. It's like a 70 calorie increase. And even that, they were like, it may even be lower than that because of some of the assumptions that we're making. So that's a lot. I mean, that's a huge difference between the two. But ultimately, that would mean that, yes, a low carbohydrate diet, if consumed for over 2 weeks, would lead to a slight boost in metabolism. Exactly how much, that is still debated. But at least they came to some sort of an agreement that potentially there is an effect. That said, however, the carbohydrate-insulin model reanalysis just happened to forget to reanalyze the body fat loss differences. And I would suspect it's probably because there are no differences. So regardless of the length of the study that you use, there are no differences in body fat loss. So the actual outcome. So metabolism is one outcome, but really what most people are interested in is body fat, right? They want to lose body fat. It's great if you get an increase in metabolism, but you also want to see a change in body fat, which is more important for a lot of people. And they did not reanalyze that. So then the argument became only about metabolism. And I should have mentioned this in my video. I wish that I had, that they just completely ignored the body fat measures or analysis, which again, I don't know this for certain, but I would imagine it's because there are no differences. So this would again go against the carbohydrate-insulin model that they espouse. So the mechanism by which they present this is they mention that ketones are probably the reason why it takes a while for it to build up, because ketones take a while to accumulate once you switch to a low carbohydrate diet. And it takes like 2 to 3 weeks, they say. And they end up mentioning that as a result, that's what leads to this increase in metabolism. Now, they don't actually go into much more detail than that, but actually it just so happens that I covered some papers by Dr. Benjamin Bickman, I think. I'm pretty sure that's him. A few years ago, back in like 2020. And he indicated in animal models that there was a relationship between greater ketones and an increase in metabolism. And the mechanism for that was due to mitochondria. So mitochondria have these two membranes, and the inner membrane can get inundated with a ton of what's called uncoupling protein. Uncoupling protein, without going into too many specifics, allows for the mass wasting of nutrients. So you're wasting a lot of nutrients to produce heat. And if you have more of this uncoupling protein, then you're sucking up a lot more nutrients and using up a lot more energy to kind of make up for that waste, for that metabolic like cycling. It's tough to describe, but essentially, typically your mitochondria is filled with these proteins called the electron transport chain. At the end of the electron transport chain, there's this complex of proteins called complex 5. When you consume nutrients and they enter the mitochondria will then convert them into NADH and FADH, two molecules. Those molecules will then interact with the aforementioned electron transport chain, and will allow for the exchange of electrons. That's why. So they take the electrons from NADH and FADH and propagate and move them, kind of hand them off to each one of these proteins all the way down the line, like an assembly line. Think of it like an assembly line, until they reach complex 4, and then you get eventually the conversion of a cellular energy molecule that is in its low energy state called ADP, adenosine diphosphate, which then interacts with with this complex 5 and converts to ATP, so the high energy version of cellular energy, adenosine triphosphate. So that's how it would conventionally work. But UCP, this uncoupling protein, will sometimes embed itself into the membrane so that that whole process becomes less efficient, so that it takes a lot more nutrients now to produce ATP. It takes many more nutrients to get sucked up into the mitochondrion to produce the same amount of adenosine triphosphate, which then can be used by the cell for energy. That's not a complete education. And if you're a little confused still, I understand it's difficult to explain this without actually giving visuals and actually giving you a bit of a lecture on the whole process. But just know that mitochondria become less efficient. You suck up more nutrients and you end up burning more energy, essentially. And that was a discovery made by Dr. Bickman's lab at Utah. I think that's where he is. And I think, as far as I know, he's gotten some scrutiny from people, not about this research necessarily, but for other things that, again, I just don't keep up with this stuff that much. So I'm not as up to date on all this stuff. But in terms of that research, I read it. I thought that was really interesting. So I think that may be a potential mechanism as to why we see this increase in metabolism. Is it going to be life-changing? No, but at least it's a benefit that would go to low-carb diets that you don't see with high-carb diets, on top of the potential satiety effects of ketones. So, but ultimately, what this all boils down to is that insulin is not this boogie hormone. Like, yes, it in isolation has body fat accrual effects, but it's not going to be, it's just not an end all be all answer. And calories, in my mind, absolutely matter, but to the point of calories in, calories out. It's not just a mathematical equation. There's so many hormones and different things that we have to consider. And my perspective, as it stands currently, is that I think we have more to blame on hyper-processed foods, hyper-palatable foods, and a little bit on genetics as well, that ultimately lead us to have difficulty losing body fat. Because as we lose body fat, regardless of the diet that you choose, it becomes your body starts fighting back against you more and more and more. So I'm going to leave that there. There's more to be said, but I'm going to leave that there for the time being, because we're what? How long are we? We're over 2 hours into this, and I know I wanted to be like Dan Carlin, but I don't think Dan Carlin sits down for 6 hours straight to do his stuff, and I think that my throat is eventually going to stop functioning. So the next thing I wanted to discuss was GlyNAC and the effect that GlyNAC has for anti-aging. As I mentioned, this was a really popular video of mine, and it has to do with the supplementation of glycine plus N-acetylcysteine. So these two amino acids get taken up by our cells, and then through a number of enzymatic reactions, they get converted into the antioxidant glutathione. Now, unfortunately, as we age, we tend to accrue more oxidative stress. So oxidative stress being the imbalance of oxidative molecules, which means that you have molecules that are molecularly unsatisfied. Let's call it that. These are molecules that their structure is needing an electron. They're scavenging for some electron to fulfill them. They're like a codependent relationship, or they're like a codependent relationship, and they're looking for their next relationship. They'll rip away an electron from perfectly functional molecules within the cells, and then to satisfy themselves. But then that damages that molecule. So then that molecule can't function like it normally does. And if that happens billions and billions of times over inside your cells, then you're doing mass damage to all the molecules within your cells, your mitochondria, your cell membrane, a bunch, the enzymes inside your cells, all kinds of different things, your endoplasmic reticulum. So there's a lot to consider there. And as we age, our antioxidant capacity are these molecules that are primed to interact with these reactive oxygen species, these oxidative molecules. When they interact, they neutralize those oxidative molecules, and they're designed to neutralize. I mean, quote unquote, designed to neutralize those oxidative molecules. So, and glutathione is one of the major ones. But as we age, we lose more of that glutathione. So the idea behind this GlyNAC supplementation, so glycine plus N-acetylcysteine, is that you can then rebolster your glutathione production. And a lot of people have asked me, well, why don't you just supplement with glutathione? It's an unstable molecule. So if you consume it, then, and it has to be in that particular conformation, the way it's put together and whatnot, it'll get broken up in your intestines. And then in your stomach and your intestines, and then it's pointless. Like you're not actually absorbing glutathione then. So unless you have a different delivery method, which I think some have considered doing, like liposomes and stuff like that, but we're not going to get into that. So one way to get around that is to increase the glycine levels and increase the cysteine levels, or N-acetylcysteine levels. And that ultimately then allows the cells to have more of the requisite nutrients to then convert those into the glutathione. And then glutathione will then reduce oxidative stress. And across the studies that I showed, which were 3, so there's one animal study, and then there were 2 human studies. One was a pilot study, so it was low. They didn't have a control, which really sucked. Because that's an absolute necessity. But that same research group ended up redoing this study that wasn't a pilot study and doing a full-fledged study with a control group and confirming a lot of the results that they found in the pilot study in humans. So they found remarkable effects across the board. They found that there were cognitive benefits, there were mitochondrial function benefits, there were inflammatory benefits, there were insulin resistance benefits. It didn't affect blood sugar specifically, but it more than halved the amount of insulin that was found in the bloodstream. So it significantly improved their insulin resistance. It improved their movement, so their ability to walk and to be able to move. And that was over a 16-week period, if I remember. So they were supplementing over those 16 weeks, and they had improvements from pre to post. So that's within treatment comparisons, pre versus post, within the one treatment, so GlyNAC. And then they had another comparison against younger adults. So looking at people that were in their 20s compared to people that were in their 70s that were supplementing. And they found that on certain measures, they were almost equivalent. So they went from having quote unquote poor health. These people weren't like horribly in bad shape, but just age. They were just aged. So these people, once they supplemented for 16 weeks, some of their like insulin resistance measures were like close to what they what the younger individuals were experiencing. Of course, the younger individuals were not supplementing with GlyNAC. So it's older supplementing with GlyNAC versus younger not supplementing with GlyNAC. But obviously, the younger individuals are going to be healthier because they're just younger in general. So people 50 years younger than they are, they're experiencing improvements in mitochondrial function. They're experiencing all these different effects at levels that are near, not always exact, but near young levels, which was really, really remarkable. And then the animal studies, they showed actual improvements in longevity, like they actually showed overall effects. Now, of course, there's drawbacks to those animal studies, especially since they're in mice, because mice obviously are mice and they have slightly different modalities of longevity. For example, they continue to grow essentially for their entire life, which is not the case necessarily for humans. So there are some drawbacks to that, and we can't necessarily jump to any conclusions, but at least preliminarily speaking, that is pretty cool. And then, of course, the fact that we do have human data that shows these improvements in mitochondrial function and all these other things. And beyond that, there are also like more specific effects, like they looked at autophagy markers, which they usually looked at that in the mouse models. And they looked at mitochondrial biogenesis markers, which is the production of new mitochondria. And all of those were improved or changed, I suppose I should say, because I don't want to say that just because they were changed a certain way that necessarily means that they led to improvements in health. There's just a relationship there. So yeah, there's just a lot there that ended up changing. And it was really remarkable. However, the one caution that I wanted to throw out there was one of the studies, the pilot study in humans, ended up showing elevated levels of ALT, so alkaline phosphatase. So that was a slight concern to me. I wasn't entirely sure why there would be an increase in ALT. So ALT is a measure of liver health, but it's also found in your bones, and it's also related to your kidneys. And typically you don't want elevated levels of ALT. You don't want super low, but you also don't want elevated levels. And that was the only thing that was quote unquote negative. I don't actually know if it's negative because nobody knows why the levels were elevated. But the researchers did other measures of like liver health, and they found no negative effects. Like all the other measures, like AST, for example, were perfectly normal. So they didn't improve, but they didn't become negative either. So I'm not entirely certain why there was a rise in ALT. It wasn't huge, but it was statistically significant. So that's the only potential drawback, or the thing that I would be interested in learning more, like as more research comes out. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is negative at this point until we actually see proof that there's something negative happening. We don't actually know. But what we do know is that there's a bunch of positive effects, a ton of positive effects from GlyNAC supplementation. And I got tons of comments from people, and a lot of people just being really kind and whatnot. Again, very humbling. But I also got some comments of people that had been supplementing with GlyNAC, and they had said like they noticed a difference after, they've been supplementing for a few years or something like that. And they had noticed a difference in their body, just how they felt in general. So that was really encouraging and really interesting to learn about from an anecdote standpoint, to stand up to the science. But also, I mentioned this to my Physionic insiders, but I'd like to also mention it here. I don't think that GlyNAC supplementation is going to help anyone that's in their 20s, 30s, and probably in their 40s either. I think that it only begins to really help maybe in your 50s, definitely in your 60s and 70s for sure, because that's what the evidence was based on and above. My understanding is that it's through this mechanism that they think it's happening, through this glutathione mechanism, although technically all they show is that there's elevated glutathione. They don't actually link glutathione to all these positive effects. So really what they would have to do is run a study where they knock out glutathione production in these animals and then supplement with GlyNAC and see if they still see these improvements. If they don't, then they know that it's through glutathione that they're having these improvements. So this is all, the glutathione angle is still correlation. It's a strong correlation. It probably is through that mechanism, but we can't say for certain based off of the evidence that we have, just to be completely clear. But that said, let's put the mechanism aside. I still think that people that have perfectly normal high levels of glutathione that don't undergo high levels of oxidative stress, especially when they take care of themselves throughout the years, GlyNAC supplementation is probably just going to be a waste of money. It's not going to do anything for you. So I mentioned that to my Physionic insiders. I didn't have that in the public version, but that was one of the nuggets of information. There were a few other nuggets of information that I had mentioned as well, but that one I specifically wanted to throw out there because I thought it might be of use to people, because I don't want people wasting their money either. If they're 45 years old and they run triathlons or whatever, you probably don't need to be taking GlyNAC. It might, as a matter of fact, be counterintuitive, because a certain level of reactive oxygen species, those oxidative molecules I was talking about, those can also be those can also be signaling molecules, and they can be beneficial to the cell, which I know is shocking. So many people talk about oxidative stress, avoid it at all costs. Well, yes, you don't want the oxidative stress, but having a little bit of those reactive oxygen species being produced is helpful to your cells. Just having too much of it is negative, and that's where you get oxidative stress. Okay, finally, I wanted to discuss hyaluronic acid, and then I want to discuss some of my upcoming investigations, so that maybe by the next episode, I'll have covered some of those as well. Hyaluronic acid for reversing skin wrinkling and skin aging. So hyaluronic acid is this molecule that it's part of your skin. So it's found in the epidermis and the dermis of your skin. So let's break down your skin into 3 layers. The skin that you're looking at, on your body, that is your stratum corneum. And there's a bunch of miniature layers that are underneath that stratum corneum. And that's where you get the skin flaking. That's where you get the loss of your skin over time. Now, one layer deeper to that you can't actually see is called the epidermis. And you can think of it like a surface, like a first layer of kind of padding. We'll call it padding. And then there's another deeper layer called the dermis. So there's stratum corneum, then you go one layer deeper, it's the epidermis, and then one layer deeper, there's the dermis, and then there's technically the hypodermis. But for skin, let's focus on those 3. For anybody that knows a lot more about skin, I realize that there are other layers as well, but those are I'm just focusing on the main ones. So the epidermis and the dermis contain hyaluronic acid. And the idea is that hyaluronic acid acts as a hydrating agent, and that's how everybody talks about it. But in all reality, hyaluronic acid does way more than just hydrating. And this comes from, I think, 11 studies that I read on the topic. And I'll get into some of those kind of in a general sense, but hyaluronic acid can come in small forms, so small molecular weight, medium molecular weight, and high molecular weight, so really large molecule. And they all serve different functions. They can, even though it's the same molecule, just in different sizes, they serve different functions. So the commonly considered mechanism is that hyaluronic acid attracts huge amounts of water. So it sucks up a bunch of water and attracts a bunch of water globules to it, up to 600 to 1,000 times its volume in that it attracts to it in water. It's remarkable, an incredible molecule, highly what's called hydrophilic. And because of that, think about that. If you have a molecule that attracts that much amount of water, if you have these invaginations in your skin, these troughs in your skin, which are wrinkles, right? A smooth, unwrinkled skin is just smooth skin. That means the epidermis and the dermis are are filled with their structural proteins, the collagens, the elastins, the hyaluronic acids. All that stuff is in its place, and it's like these architectures that are holding up the skin, holding it nice and flat. But as we age, we start to do damage to all these structural proteins, and I'll get into collagen, I'll get into elastin, all that stuff in the future, but for now we're looking at hyaluronic acid. But so you start to have these kind of open spaces where you don't have these protein architectures that can hold up the skin. So to make up for that, what you can do is use this hyaluronic acid will attract all this water and plump up the skin. Not completely, it's not going to completely reverse anything, but it at least fills up the space with water, so you're pushing some of that skin back upwards. So that's kind of the general commonly understood mechanism. But hyaluronic acid also has a stability effect. It stabilizes other proteins like collagen and elastin. It also can bind to receptors on fibroblasts and keratinocytes, which are skin cells. It can lead to the production of more collagen. It can lead to the production of more elastin, obviously more hyaluronic acid. It has a number of different effects. It can lead to the migration of skin cells from the lower reaches of the cell to the higher reaches of the skin, I should say, from lower reaches of the skin to the higher reaches of the skin, and therefore populate those areas. As we age, however, hyaluronic acid tends to drop in the epidermis. So remember, stratum corneum, next layer epidermis, next layer dermis, which is deeper. Dermis is the deepest layer that we're discussing. So the epidermis is that middle layer, and that's where the troughs are probably going to occur the most, because it's that first layer right beneath the surface. So we lose significant amounts of hyaluronic acid in that region, and we don't lose a whole lot in our dermis. So the dermis still continues to have high levels of hyaluronic acid, as I understood it by these scientific reviews that I read. And the epidermis loses almost all of it, virtually all of it over time. So the idea is, if we supplement with hyaluronic acid, can we then reintroduce hyaluronic acid into that epidermis? And the research that I read is just straight. I'm not going to use more aggressive words. It's horrible. A lot of the research is industry funded. And again, I'm not going to throw studies away just because they're industry funded, but you can throw studies away if they are horribly designed and if they are horribly performed. And some of these studies are absolutely laughable. I mean, they are disgustingly laughable. So bad. Which, if you want to hear some of my opinions on that, as I go and actually analyze the studies, you can go over and watch that video. That's detailed study analysis on that topic. But they're really badly performed. So the evidence is really weak, not because there aren't a lot of studies. There are a lot of studies, but they're so horribly performed that my confidence in them is literally zero for certain ones, and it's low in others, and it's kind of in the middle for others. But there's no high quality study, like really high quality studies. So my verdict on hyaluronic acid, if it's topical, there's very low evidence for it. But the evidence that is there indicates that there is an improvement, like there's a betterment with the topical addition of hyaluronic acid. The oral consumption of hyaluronic acid does seem to have a little bit better research behind it, and does seem to have a benefit as well. And finally, injection of hyaluronic acid. We're not talking about massive like needles or anything. We're talking about like micro needles, like you can barely see them. That seems to also be potentially beneficial. But again, the research there has been really bad. And every study is industry funded, every single one. Some of them, the researchers are all being paid, like their salary is from the industry. So the level of bias, potential bias, I'll say potential bias, is unbelievably high for some of these studies. And all of them have at least a little bit of potential bias. So do I feel strongly about that verdict? Do I say, oh yeah, topical hyaluronic acid, absolutely, it absolutely works? Until we actually have independent studies, And I only found one scientific review that was done by university, no affiliation to any of the industry. And they ended up indicating also that they feel that, yes, it probably helps, but, we need a lot more research that's independently funded, that's university or publicly or nonprofit funded, rather than focusing on industry funding. But unfortunately, that's what we have right now. So topical, low level of evidence, but I'm leaning towards yes. And I've already finished that investigation, unlike the sucralose one. And oral consumption of hyaluronic acid, I would say, is stronger, yes. But it's not like the effects are going to be massive. But, at least from the images that I saw, I could tell a difference. But then again, maybe it's just my bias, my bias presenting itself. So, it's another, I guess, one more thing that I should mention. Another thing is that a lot of people critique hyaluronic acid. They say, well, there's no way for it to be topically effective because it's too large of a molecule and it can't be hydrolyzed. It can't be cut up or broken down into a smaller version, which then enters the skin and affects the epidermis and the dermis. And the bottom line is that's not true. Yes, if you use a high molecular weight hyaluronic acid, then yes, it will stay on your skin and it will hydrate your skin, but it will not penetrate into your skin. So yes, I understand that. But it seems like, at least based off of this more university-backed scientific review, that lower molecular weight hyaluronic acid does have an effect, can penetrate into the dermis from being exposed to the skin. So that is a mechanism by which it can work. And of course, if you take it orally, then your pepsidases and whatnot that happen in your intestines will take care of all of the high molecular weight hyaluronic acid. And additionally, it's not just a hydrating agent. So it's not like it just enters the skin and just hydrates. It actually has other functions as well. So I wouldn't look at it that way in such a single mechanism perspective. So my confidence is low, but it's leaning towards yes. That's what I would say. Now, in terms of which molecular weight size that you should focus on, I mentioned that for my insiders. And I also mentioned the amount that has been shown to work, based off the evidence. So if you're interested in that, certainly join my Physionic Insiders. Now, with that said, let me finish by saying the next few things I'm going to be investigating. So maybe next podcast I'll be able to discuss these as well. So I've already finished my omega-3 fatty acids, so my fish oil supplementation on cognition in mildly cognitively impaired individuals. So does it have an effect on memory? Does it have an effect on language? Does it have an effect on executive function? Does it have an effect on all these different metrics of memory or the mind, cognition? So I read, 8 studies, 7 studies, something along those lines, along with a meta-analysis of, 17 studies, something along those lines. I could be off on those numbers, but a good amount of evidence to come to the conclusions that I did, which I'll save for next time. Another one is to look at 1 meal a day on insulin sensitivity. So I released when I was first starting to do my actual study analyses, I released a video on 1 meal a day, and I ended up concluding that the way that the study was designed, it led to worse insulin sensitivity, or I guess I should say worse blood sugar tolerance. And I got a lot of backlash on that video. A lot of people were like, well, that hasn't been my experience. And it's a whole nother fight that I'll discuss some other time. Maybe I think I have discussed some of that on the podcast before, so I may not address it, but I am going to I have a video already edited and ready to go that is going to address that critique. But specifically this investigation, I think I have 4 studies that there haven't been a whole lot on OMAD, so 1 meal a day. But I have 4 studies, and I'm going to be I've already finished reading them, analyzing them. I just need to create the content for it. And I'll discuss that on the next podcast, hopefully. 1 meal a day on insulin sensitivity. Next one is nitric oxide on blood pressure. So looking at particular nutrients that increase nitric oxide, and do they have an effect at lowering blood pressure? Another one is tadalafil, so Cialis on erectile dysfunction and testosterone. I think I've almost finished my investigation on that. And then the other one is collagen on skin, so to supplement my hyaluronic acid video. I've been very interested in skincare. I'd like to get on top of it while I'm still, young-ish, so that I can have the best possible practices now that are science-based. Because I've always wondered to myself, like, all these ingredients in here, like which ones are actually effective? And to be completely honest, I got to be honest with you, I just don't trust dermatologists. Not because I don't believe in what they do. I 100% believe in what they do, but I just don't trust that a lot of doctors have the time to sit there and analyze research to the depth that I feel that I have been trying to do, and I'm working at getting better and better at it. So, like knowing the statistical method to use in a particular situation, some of the pitfalls, like reading abstracts to me just doesn't count as you've read the research. So, and I think that dermatologists, they're busy with their clinical practices and whatnot. They just learn about it from like a book or from like some councils or whatever. And it's not that I don't trust those people, but I would rather just look at it myself and determine some of these things. So hyaluronic acid, collagen, retinol is another one. Squalane is another one. There's a lot of different ones that I'd like to investigate, and I'd like to do that earlier on in my life rather than later in my life, because trying to stay as young as possible, forever young. That was horrible. Okay, I'm done. Thank you for listening to me up to this point. Hopefully you learned something. I genuinely hope that I'm actually providing some value to you. And this is a journey. I've got so much more I have to go. I have so much more. I'm painfully aware of my ignorance on certain subjects, and I'm working tirelessly. I literally work at least 6.5 days a week, and I have been for the last 9 years. So for me, it's been a labor of love, but I am obsessed with getting much, much better at study analyses, and I have much more to learn. Although I will say I'm very proud of the progress that I've made since the beginning. I mean, it is leaps and bounds. And I've actually taken down hundreds of videos not because I felt the information was bad. I still agree with a lot of that information, but I just think that it doesn't represent my new style of being far more detail-oriented about the study analyses and then coming out with mechanisms, as I explained earlier. So, I have a lot more to learn. I'm on my journey. I thank you for being part of that journey, especially if you've gotten to the end of this podcast. I think you're the type of person that I really appreciate being able to expound on some of these topics. So I really appreciate you. Thank you. And until next one, bye.